My name is Harper Evans. I used to believe I was the only daughter in a picture-perfect family in Charleston, where every framed photo whispered love. But one Sunday afternoon when I came home to grab my wallet before heading to Mom's birthday party, I accidentally overheard a conversation behind a slightly ajar door. She's not blood, she doesn't know anything. It was my husband's voice, and my sister's. I froze, heart pounding like a drum. They were talking about me. About an identity I had believed in for 29 years. Have you ever heard your own name? Spoken with contempt by the people closest to you. If you've ever felt like a stranger in your own family, leave a comment below. Don't forget to like and follow the channel. Because right now I'm about to tell you what happened when I discovered I was the daughter of a woman buried in silence. I stood still behind the door, breath caught in my throat. What I heard wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a cruel joke. It wasn't a strange dream after a long afternoon nap. It was the truth. And it shattered everything I thought I knew about my life. I don't remember how I left the house. Only that I never made it to Mom's birthday party. I walked straight to the beach near our home where my father once taught me to ride a bike. Or at least, I used to believe he did. The waves lapped softly at the sand, whispering with each swell. Not blood. I sat on a sun-bleached wooden bench, heart racing, as Emily's words echoed through my head like a curse. That evening, after the sun had dipped fully behind the palms and I had run out of excuses to hide, I returned home. Margot was sitting in the living room, a glass of red wine in hand, her gaze a little tired but completely calm. She looked at me as if everything was still normal. "You're back? We need to talk." I didn't circle around it. I didn't want to perform anymore. Margot set the glass down slowly. "About what, sweetheart?" I clenched my teeth. "About not being your biological daughter." The air seemed to freeze. Margot didn't respond right away. She looked at me for so long I thought she hadn't heard. Then she tilted her head slightly, her voice eerily composed. "Who told you that?" "I heard Emily and Noah talking. You knew, everyone knew, except me." Pause. Then Margot stood and slipped on her cardigan like she'd suddenly felt cold. "Harper," she exhaled, "you've always been my daughter. I raised you from infancy, whatever Emily said, maybe. Then who are you? And who was my real mother?" My voice hardened. I felt like I was speaking to a stranger. No longer the woman who once read me bedtime stories or held me when I failed my college entrance exams. It all felt like a role she had played. Margot looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in her eyes. "You don't need to dig up the past, Harper," she said, voice trembling. "It'll only hurt you." I went silent for a few seconds, then nodded and turned away. I didn't sleep that night. Every corner of the house seemed to whisper stories I had never been told. At 3 a.m. I walked down to the basement. The air smelled of dampness and dust. There were old cardboard boxes I had once been told not to touch. After some searching I found it, a worn brown leather suitcase with a rusted metal clasp. Inside were the scattered remnants of a woman I had never known, but who looked eerily like me. A purple wool scarf, a children's book written in Spanish, a necklace with a broken clasp. And buried among old documents, I found a copy of a birth certificate. My name. Mother, Lucia Rivera. Father, not listed. I sat down on the cold cement floor, hands trembling as I held the paper. In a faded red note scribbled beneath the remarks section, it read, "Mother died in a household accident. 7-month-old infant transferred to temporary guardian, Margot Evans." My head was spinning. All the stories, your first high fever, your first steps on the backyard grass, they could have all been fabricated. I folded the paper, tucked it into my pocket, then carefully lifted each item as if it might crumble to dust. I didn't know why Margot had kept the suitcase. Maybe guilt. Maybe she thought I'd never be brave enough to step into that basement. But I had. And I had found the truth. Back in my room, I remained in front of the mirror for a long time, wondering, whose face is this? Is it Harper Evans, the girl Margot gave a name that never truly belonged to her? Or Harper Rivera, the daughter of a woman named Lucia, who had been erased from every family story? I didn't have the answer, I only knew one thing. In the morning, I'd return to the basement. And this time, I'd open every box. I'd trace every thread they tried to bury. I needed to know who Lucia was. I needed to know why she died and why everyone kept me in the dark. Because if my memories were fabricated, then I would be the one to rewrite the truth. The next morning, I woke up feeling like part of my heart was still trapped in that basement. I had read the birth certificate so many times I had memorized each crease. The name, Lucia Rivera, burned into my mind like a stranger I now had to learn to love. Though something deep inside me already knew she was my blood. I opened my laptop and searched through public medical archives, hoping for any trace. I started with the hospital where I was born. St. Margaret's Community Hospital, a small facility on the outskirts of Charleston, now converted into a rehabilitation center. Most records had been digitized, but those from nearly 3 decades ago were blurry and incomplete. I spent the entire morning calling records offices, requesting a copy of Lucia's death certificate. Under cause of death, it read, "Accidental fall, closed case." But in the margin a small handwritten note in blue ink stopped me cold. Signed, Irene McCall, RN. I found her through the State Nurses Association. She had retired years ago and now lived in a quiet riverfront town nearly 2 hours from Charleston. I sent her an email explaining that I was the relative of a former patient named Lucia Rivera and hoped to speak about what happened in 1995. To my surprise, Irene responded almost immediately. The email was simple but unmistakably direct. "If you truly are Lucille's daughter, I believe it's time the truth is told." 2 days later, I drove to that small town. The wind from the marshes brushed against the car windows, mixing salt and damp moss in the air. Irene's home was modest, with a white picket fence and blooming jasmine vines. She waited for me on the porch, white hair tied back, eyes sharp despite being nearly 70. "You have your mother's eyes," she said as soon as she saw me. Lucia had that same look, sad and strong. I faced her, my hand clutching my purse. "I need to know what really happened." Irene wasn't surprised. She poured tea slowly, then looked at me like she was weighing how much truth was safe to reveal. "Lucia came to the hospital the first time when she was 7 months pregnant with you," she began. "She had bruises on her arm and rib cage. Said she slipped, but her eyes said something else." I stiffened. "The second time was when she gave birth," she continued. "I was the attending nurse that day. Lucia came in alone, no one with her. She didn't complain, didn't cry, but I remember, clear as day. She held you so tightly when we brought her to recovery, like she was afraid someone would take you away." "And after that?" I asked, my throat dry. 3 weeks after discharge, I got a call from the police. A young mother had died at home after a fall down the stairs. Name of the deceased? Lucia Rivera. I felt ice crawl through my entire body. "But it wasn't an accident," Irene said firmly. "I knew it the moment I saw the name. Lucia wasn't careless. And I remember, just 3 days before she died, she came back to the hospital and asked if there was a way to temporarily place her baby in a women's protection program. He said she was scared, that the man who was trying to hold on to her had once choked her during an argument, that he didn't want to lose custody. She was preparing to file for divorce. She had already submitted the paperwork. What was his name?" Irene stared at me for a long moment, then opened the drawer of the wooden table by the porch. She pulled out an old, yellowed envelope containing a copy of a police intake report, dated August 18, 1995. The name of the accused, Douglas A. Evans. My hands shook as I held the paper, reading each line like barbed wire piercing through my chest. "I didn't know anything. Douglas, he was the one who raised me." "Not raised," Irene said, her voice dropping. "Payne became your legal guardian after Lucia died. The paperwork was completed suspiciously fast. I remember filing a request to reopen the case, but it was closed quickly. There was no autopsy. And no one did anything?" "Margot Evans was his new wife at the time," she said. "And she was also the one listed in the application as your temporary foster mother. She had strong connections in the community. Everything was quietly swept away." I leaned back in my chair, the world tilting. Irene placed her hand gently over mine, warm and steady. I've been silent for 29 years because no one asked, no one dared to, but you came here, and if you want the truth, I'll help you find it. I met her gaze, eyes stinging. I wasn't crying from weakness. I was crying because, for the first time, someone remembered my mother as a real person, with a name, a face, a breath. Lucia. That name had never once been spoken in my house. No photos, no stories. Only a void. Wrapped in the beautiful lies I once believed. I tightened my grip on the police report. Paper can rot. People can disappear. But the truth, once it starts to show, won't stay buried. And I wouldn't let my mother be erased from history ever again. I returned to Charleston over the weekend, carrying the police report Irene had given me and a heavy ache inside, like something that never got the chance to breathe had been buried too soon. I needed to know more. Not about how my mother died, but about what she left behind. What I believed had been quietly stolen, just like her very existence. I went to the law office listed in the old estate records. James Whitlow, a man in his 60s who had been the Evans family's attorney for years. His office sat in a red brick building with a black shingle roof and a faded brass sign reading, Whitlow and Associates, STE, 1984. The receptionist asked me to schedule an appointment, but when I placed my birth certificate and a copy of the original will I had found in the basement on the counter, she froze. "You're Harper Rivera?" I nodded. She held my gaze for a moment, then whispered, "I'll let Mr. Whitlow know right away." A few minutes later, I was invited into his office. Attorney Whitlow had tousled silver hair and gold-rimmed glasses. He looked at me as though facing a ghost from the past he'd hoped would never return. "Miss Evans, or should I say Rivera," he began. "I'm here to ask about my mother's will, Lucia Rivera," I said, taking the seat across from him, "and why I was never told she left anything for me." He sighed, opened a drawer and pulled out an old file. "I suppose. It's time. I was the one who drafted both versions of your mother's will," he began. "The first one was created right after you were born. Lucia wanted to leave her entire estate, including the house on Greenway, a savings account and a small scholarship fund she had started for single mothers, to Harper Rivera. That is, you. And the second? It was submitted about 3 weeks after Lucia's death." He paused. "It stated that Lucia had been deemed mentally unfit, thus voiding the original will. The assets were transferred in full to the legal guardian, Douglas Evans." Leave the blood rush to my head. "And you believed that? That a woman who had just given birth wasn't mentally competent?" Whitlow's expression tightened, as if bracing for impact. "No, I didn't," he said slowly, "but I was told to believe it." I leaned back. "You were threatened?" "Douglas came to see me, said Lucia had mental issues before the birth. Claimed she'd been under treatment. Told me that if I didn't certify the new version, he'd sue me for legal malpractice regarding the first one. I had a family, a reputation. I'm not proud, Harper. You helped erase a valid will. You stole from a child. You destroyed a mother's final wishes." My voice was flat. "I know. I kept the original, but I was too afraid to expose it. I never thought you'd come back. Never thought you'd find out." He stared at the file in front of me. "I want copies of every document, the original will, the intake report, financial transactions. Any paperwork you ever signed with Douglas. What are you planning to do?" "I'm going to reclaim what belonged to my mother. And I need you as a witness." Whitlow hesitated. Then he removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "It's time," I corrected my mistake. He opened the safe in the corner and took out a folder carefully clipped inside a hardback cover. It was the original will, signed by Lucia and 2 witnesses. "She came in one afternoon in March," he recalled, gently touching the front page. "She held you in her arms, crying, while writing your name into the scholarship fund she created, hoping to help other young mothers avoid her fate. She was clear. She was sane. She wasn't unstable, she wasn't incompetent, she was just alone. I couldn't say a word. My hands trembled as I took the copied documents. One page listed the total asset value at that time, $92,500 in cash, a home valued at $120,000, and a scholarship fund worth over $20,000. Not much to the wealthy, but for an immigrant single mother working night shifts as a nurse, it was a fortune made of love. I felt as though I had been placed back onto the map of my own life. No longer a name tacked onto the back of the Evans family, but a person with a history, with a mother who had tried to leave something behind before that right was stolen from her. "I'll testify," he said. "If it comes to court, I'll stand up. I owe Lucia. And I owe you that much." Justice, slow as it was, had begun to stir. And I at last was stepping out of the shadow someone else had drawn around me. I came home with the folder in my hands, heart heavy like I had just emerged from a quiet trial in the past. Every signature from my mother was both a love letter and a condemnation. But I knew emotion wouldn't make them pay. I needed proof. Clear, undeniable, in their own voices. So I reached out to Carmen, my best friend from college, the only person I could trust right now. "Harper," she whispered after hearing the entire story, "if you need someone to plant a device, I've got one." The next evening, Carmen showed up with a tiny recording device, no bigger than a fingertip, that could be activated remotely. We tucked it behind the wedding photo frame in the living room, right where the family always gathered to discuss things. "I'll turn it on when they arrive," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I only need them to say it once." And the opportunity came sooner than I expected. Saturday afternoon, Margot called me down to the kitchen and said they'd be coming over for dinner. "Emily wants to apologize," she said, not meeting my eyes. "And your father has some things he wants to discuss with you and Noah." I acted as if I didn't suspect a thing. But my heart was pounding. By the time the sun had set, all four of them were there. Douglas brought a bottle of red wine. Margot laid out her signature lasagna, the kind she always made for guests. And Emily, true to form, walked into my house like it belonged to her. I had already turned the recorder on, then faked a headache and excused myself upstairs, leaving them in the living room. I sat in the bedroom barely breathing, ears pressed to the headphones wired directly to the device. It began with small talk, a few compliments about dinner, then a sigh. "Harper's been acting a little off lately." Then Douglas's voice, low and clear. "We need to finalize the scholarship fund. If we wait too long, it might get flagged under the new law." "Best to transfer it to Emily," Margot added. "Harper doesn't know how to manage it. She still thinks she inherited the fund." "What about the main inheritance?" Emily asked, her voice like ice. "It's already split," Douglas replied. "Most of it's in your mother's account. The rest, if we can keep Harper quiet, we'll call it a wedding gift." That was the deal, wasn't it? My fist clenched involuntarily. Then Noah's voice. Deep, hesitant. "If any of this comes out, Harper could sue. She's already asking questions. The other day she brought up the bank documents." "Then don't let it come out," Douglas said. "Noah, you're her husband. It's your job to keep her in check." "You loved Emily once, remember?" Margot chimed in like it was nothing. "You married Harper because she was easy, because she made everything legal." Emily laughed. "And sweet, and trusting, and easy to handle." I pulled the headphones off, staring blankly at the bed. It wasn't just my inheritance or my name that had been stolen. Even my marriage, the one piece of peace I thought I had, was staged. I used to think that even if my stepmother was cold, my stepfather rigid, and my sister competitive, at least Noah loved me. But love can be a weapon in the hands of those who know how to perform. I waited until the laughter downstairs faded, until the clinking of glasses stopped, then walked down. I stayed silent. Offered a faint smile when Emily gave her fake hug, gave a quiet nod when Margot said goodnight. I played the role of Harper Evans, the dutiful daughter-in-law of the Evans family, for the last time. When the door closed behind them, I stood in the living room, staring at the frame where the red recording lights still glowed. I pressed the save button. Time-stamped, clear audio, voices recorded, an irrefutable piece of evidence. I spent the entire next morning reopening every box in the basement, not to find more proof, but to find something real, personal. I needed to see my mother as a human being, not a name on a birth certificate or a line in a will. I needed to feel her, Lusa Rivera, beyond the documents and the prematurely closed case file. At the bottom of a dusty wooden trunk, between scraps of baby clothes, yellowed medical records, and a neatly folded mint-colored wool blanket, I found a brown envelope, sealed with cracked red wax. On the front, written in wobbly purple ink, Para Maria. If I'm gone, please don't let Harper grow up in the dark. My chest tightened. I opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, nearly 3 pages long, in delicate slanted handwriting. The date at the top read, August 4th, 1995. Just 2 weeks before my mother died. Dear Maria, I know you're tired juggling 100 things in Texas, but I have to write this in case something happens, so Harper won't grow up never knowing who I was. Things here aren't good. Douglas is getting more controlling. He lashes out for no reason, locks up money, hides my papers. You know I forgave him too many times thinking Harper needed a father. But now I see, so clearly, I was wrong. I'm trying to get out of all of it. I've been to the legal center to ask about divorce. Remember that lawyer from before, Whitlow? He agreed to help me. But I know Douglas won't let me go easily. I'm not writing to complain, I'm writing to ask you. If the worst happens, if I'm gone, please find Harper. Don't let them treat her like property. She is the only light in my life, Maria. The only reason I haven't given up. My tears fell on the page, blurring the final lines. Inside the envelope was a small folded note, faded blue with age. My mother's handwriting again, shorter this time. Like a final whisper. If something happens, let her know the truth. She is the only light in my life. I clutched the note in my hand, feeling like I was touching her hand, but only in someone else's memory. It burned and comforted all at once. I tucked the letter into my coat pocket, then immediately opened my phone. I searched for Maria Rivera, Texas plus Catholic Church. After some digging, I found a listing for Sister Maria Rivera, currently living and working in a small convent on the outskirts of San Antonio. I sent an email with a photo of the letter. Less than 15 minutes later, I received a reply. Harper, if it's truly you, then thank God you survived to this day. Call me anytime. I've waited nearly 30 years for this call. Less than 3 days later, I arrived in San Antonio. The convent where Aunt Maria lived in seclusion was a simple stone compound, surrounded by heavy-laden orange trees and whispering oak groves. She stood waiting at the gate, small in frame, hair nearly all silver. But her eyes, they were unmistakably mine. We embraced for a long time. She didn't ask anything right away. She simply held my hand and led me to the back garden, where a stone bench sat beneath a canopy of green. You look heartbreakingly like Lucia, she said, tears in her eyes. I don't remember anything about her, I whispered. I only learned her name a few weeks ago. She gently squeezed my hand. Because they didn't let you remember. I told her everything I'd uncovered. The birth certificate, the will, the recording, the attorney's statement. Then I pulled out my mother's letter and placed it in her hands. Aunt Maria read every word slowly, then pressed the letter to her chest like she was holding something that had been lost for far too long. Your mother was brave but alone, she said. After you were born, she wrote to me every week. Every letter talked about you. Your laugh, how you reached out to be held, but also about her fear, about feeling trapped in a house that no longer felt like home. I once tried to get custody of you, she continued, voice catching. I flew to Charleston, went to the hearing, but the court denied my petition because I didn't have a stable income. I was part-time in formation and doing volunteer work at a small parish. They said I was unfit to care for an infant. I swallowed hard. They chose a man who had been accused of abuse over a woman willing to give up everything to raise her niece? Money and reputation are what define fitness in their eyes, she said, her eyes glistening. I prayed every night that one day you'd find the truth, and today you did. We remained quiet together. The wind rustled through the trees like the whisper of memory. I no longer saw my mother as a faded shadow in a case file. I saw her as a young woman, holding her baby late at night, writing to her sister in fear and fragile hope. A mother who fought for me in the only way she could, through words. And I, by finding them, was finally learning how to love her fully. It took me 3 days to organize everything: the documents, the evidence, my mother's letter, the recording, and the original signed will. I printed copies, numbered each page, labeled each file, carefully, like preparing for trial. But, in truth, I was only preparing for dinner. One final dinner, where the table would no longer be a place of gathering, but where the truth would be served, layer by layer, like the main course they never expected. I invited them all, Margot, Douglas, Emily, and Noah, with a short text. Saturday night, 7 p.m. I have something important to share. Please be there. I figured they were curious but still convinced I was fragile, broken, seeking a chance to forgive. They hadn't yet realized I no longer needed their approval. Dinner was simple: butternut squash soup, toasted bread, lemon roasted chicken, and autumn salad. I set the table properly, placed a glass of white wine beside each plate. Nothing indicated this would be the first course of reckoning. They arrived on time. Margot walked in first, wearing a plum-colored dress, face composed as if she'd never buried a mother in her daughter's memory. Douglas followed with a bottle of wine like he still ran the household. Emily entered last. Bright red lipstick, eyes flashing with barely concealed contempt. Noah trailed behind her, slow and uncertain, hands in his pockets, silent. "Thank you for coming," I said once they were all seated. Dinner started with small talk. Margot asked about work, Douglas asked about home renovations. I responded briefly, politely. As dessert was being served, I set my spoon down. "I know everything now." No one lifted a fork. Emily looked up and sneered. "Know what?" "I know I'm not Margot's biological daughter. I know my real mother was Lucia Rivera, and I know what happened to her." Douglas leaned back slightly. Margot gripped her wine glass, struggling to stay composed. I opened the folder beside me, pulling out paper after paper, audio files labeled and clipped. "This is the original will signed by my mother and attorney Whitlow. This is my real birth certificate. This is the recording from 2 weeks ago. Of all 4 of you in this house." I hit play. The room fell silent except for the voices spilling from the small speaker in the center of the table. Margot's, Douglas's, Emily's, Noah's. Each word sliced through the air like a knife. "Transfer the scholarship fund to Emily. Keep Harper quiet with the wedding and a small allowance. She's easy to control." I glanced at each of them as the recording ended. Margot sat frozen. Douglas exhaled, eyes lowered. Noah was stone still. "Emily." Emily smiled. "So what?" she said. "You think a few papers and recordings change anything? You're illegitimate. An accident. A leftover name. No one ever wanted you here." "You're right," I said evenly. "I'm the daughter of a woman you let die. And I have proof. Everything in this family was supposed to be mine. You were only kept out of pity. The only thing you've got is a last name no one wants." I stood up, facing her. "And what do you have, Emily? A stepfather scared of exposure? A stepmother who buried guilt beneath the name of love? Or a man who once loved you, but married me for a signature at the bank?" Noah lowered his head, said nothing. I pulled my mother's letter from the envelope, my voice softer now. "Before she died, my mom wrote to Aunt Maria, 'If I'm gone, let her know the truth. She is the only light in my life.' I grew up with no memory of my mother. No photos, no voice, no scent. But I have something none of you do. I have the truth. And I have the strength my mother left behind, with everything she had." Margot began to cry. Douglas remained silent. Emily turned away, her glare simmering like embers. None of them spoke again after that. For the first time in nearly 30 years, that dining table witnessed a dinner without pretense. After that night, I never returned to the old house. I didn't contact anyone from that family again. Instead, The next morning, I walked into the office of Jillian Hart, a renowned attorney specializing in complex inheritance cases, and the first person to look at me as a person, not a problem to manage. Jillian listened for 2 straight hours without interrupting. When I played the recording, when I laid out the wills, both real and forged, her expression gradually turned to ice. By the time I handed her the handwritten letter from my mother and the copied medical records, she said only one thing. "Harper, if you're ready, we're not just reclaiming justice, we're reclaiming the history they tried to erase you from." I nodded, no hesitation. 3 weeks later, the formal lawsuit was filed in Charleston County Court. Harper Rivera v. Douglas Evans, Margot Evans, Emily Evans, and Noah Matthews, on charges of will forgery, inheritance theft, accessory to suspicious death, and conspiracy to commit financial fraud. The media began paying attention when the altered will and suspicious scholarship fund transfer were listed in court records. I stayed silent publicly, but in the closed hearing room the truth surfaced, layer by layer. With forensic expertise and modern technology, a special state team was dispatched to reconstruct the scene of Lucia Rivera's death, based on the medical file copy I had retrieved. After nearly 30 years, what seemed lost revealed new traces on the staircase railing. The pusher's height, the angle of impact, the force, all matched to a 3D model. And then the result flashed on the screen, like a blow to the silence. The imprint matched the height and dominant right-handed force of Douglas Evans. Jillian placed her hand over mine as the judge read the findings aloud. I squeezed back. Not from fear, but because, finally, after all these shadowed years, my mother's name was spoken. In truth, in the following hearings, Margot was forced to admit she knew Lucia had called the police the week of the accident. She had even been present at the house that night. But when asked why she didn't report the fall, she repeated the same sentence. "I thought she slipped." Jillian's voice stayed steady. "And you believe a woman holding her baby in the middle of the night somehow slipped without a single mark on either hand?" The entire courtroom fell silent. Emily, on the other hand, acted like she was the victim. In front of the court, she sobbed, claiming I had destroyed the family, that I was ungrateful for being raised with her parents' money. But when the documents showing the scholarship fund had been transferred into her name were presented, along with the recording of her saying, "Just let the girl sign, she doesn't understand anything, 1 wedding dress and she's done," those tears turned into nothing more than a cheap performance. Emily was stripped of her inheritance, the scholarship fund was frozen, pending further review in the next court session. Noah didn't appear at the first 2 hearings, but at the third he showed up, sitting quietly in the corner, hands trembling. When called to testify, he admitted, "I loved Emily, but they made me marry Harper to keep the assets in the family. I knew it was wrong. I didn't think it would go this far." Jillian asked bluntly, "Did you participate in the plan to transfer the scholarship fund, force the marriage, and forge legal documents?" Noah gave a slow nod. "Did you or did you not threaten Harper that if she refused to sign over her financial rights, you would file for divorce along with fabricated psychological records to revoke her inheritance?" Noah broke down in tears. Not out of remorse, but because he knew it was over. In the end, the judge ruled Douglas Evans was officially indicted for second-degree murder in the reopened 1997 case. He was taken into custody on the spot. Margot Evans was sentenced to 12 months probation and fined for being an accessory to concealment and will forgery. She was ordered to step down from all leadership positions in the family foundation. Emily lost all inheritance rights, had every account tied to the scholarship fund suspended, and was banned from accessing any property linked to my mother's name. Noah Matthews was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and financial coercion through marriage. I stood there for a long time, not out of regret, not out of anger, but because I knew. The truth couldn't return what was lost, but it could open a door. For the first time, for me to live under the name my mother gave me, Harper Rivera. No permission, no apology, no longer hidden in the dark. I remained in the state civil registry office, eyes fixed on the certificate bearing my new identity. Or rather, the long-buried one finally brought to light. For the first time in my life, the name Harper Rivera appeared. Complete, official, without hyphens, without the note. Adopted daughter of Douglas and Margot Evans. I signed it. My hand didn't shake. The clerk smiled, handed me the paper and said softly, "Mrs. Rivera would be proud." I stepped out of the building, into the gentle March sunlight of Texas. It felt like it had been waiting to welcome me home all along. Aunt Maria greeted me with a long embrace. Her house sat on the outskirts of Austin. Warm brown brick, a wide porch, and blooming magnolia trees. Nothing grand, but from the very first step I felt safer than I ever had in any Evans estate. She didn't ask how long I planned to stay. She just handed me the keys and said, "Stay as long as you need. But don't leave because you feel like a burden. Leave only when you're ready to start something for yourself." I chose to stay. 3 months later, I took a part-time job at a local high school as a student counselor. Not a fancy title, not a big paycheck, but for the first time I listened to kids like I once was. Kids trapped in families where hurt had no name. I met a girl named Anna, 12 years old, always looking down, always apologizing for things no one blamed her for. When I asked, "Who do you think is at fault?" she answered, "Probably me, because I was born." I sat in silence for a full minute, then said gently, "I used to feel the same way, but someone once wrote to me, 'You are the only light in my life.'" Anna didn't fully understand, but her eyes no longer darted away. I knew then I had chosen the right path. On the first legal anniversary of my mother Lucia's death, adjusted by the court after the ruling, I held the launch event for the Lucia Rivera Foundation, a small nonprofit with its first office inside a repurposed campus building at the University of Texas. A sign at the door read, "Protect the light, reclaim the truth." The foundation's mission is to provide legal and psychological support to minors who lost loved ones to domestic violence, were wrongly removed from biological guardians, or abandoned by the very systems meant to protect them. Aunt Maria was the first to sign the founding board. Jillian Hart became our honorary legal advisor, and I, as founder, didn't take the title of director. I chose survivor and witness. There were no celebrities at the launch, but there was a reserved row for former classmates of my mother, people who had once heard Lucia play violin at the tiny church every Sunday. One elderly woman approached me, took my hand and said, "Lucia once said, 'If I have a child, she will never be locked in silence.' Today you kept that promise for her." I turned away, hiding my tears. That night, back home, I opened the old wooden box Aunt Maria had kept for decades. Inside were a wooden comb, a piece of lace veil, and a small brown leather notebook. On the first page, in soft, slanted handwriting, "If my daughter finds this notebook, it means she survived the storm. Let her know she was never an accident. She was the most beautiful thing I ever brought into this world." I closed the notebook, placed my hand on my chest, and whispered into the dark, "Mom, I'd returned to my real name." Early morning. The cemetery lay quiet beneath a thin veil of fog, with only the sound of wind brushing through the old oak trees. I walked slowly along the gravel path, holding a bouquet of white peonies, the flower Aunt Maria said Mom loved. I stopped in front of the granite headstone, now newly inscribed thanks to the final legal ruling, Lucia Rivera, 196519995. Mother, musician, survivor, never silenced. I bent down, laid the bouquet at the base, and sat on the grass as if talking to someone still alive. My voice was soft but steady. "I am your daughter. They used to call me Harper Evans. They wanted me to believe I should be grateful for being rescued. But now, I live as Harper Rivera. Your daughter. A woman erased from records, from memory, even from this cemetery, for nearly 30 years. I placed my hand on the cold stone and added, "I won't stay silent anymore, and I won't let anyone else grow up in the dark like I did." The sun began to rise, casting a soft beam of light through the branches, landing exactly where I sat. I'm not superstitious, but in that moment I felt held, no longer alone. A few months later, I finished the final draft of my memoir titled The Forgotten Daughter. I wrote it with the voice of a child who was once erased. who once thought love was conditional and truth was a luxury. The book was published in early spring by an independent press in Austin and unexpectedly went viral on digital platforms. Within a week, it reached the New York Times bestseller list. But what moved me most were the letters from readers. A woman in Minnesota wrote, "I used to think I was the biological daughter of the man who abused my mother. But your book gave me the courage to take a DNA test, and I found my real family." A college student wrote, "For the first time, I saw someone demand justice without shouting and still make the world listen." I folded each letter and placed them in a wooden box next to my mother's photo. Each note was a testament that Lucia Rivera was not forgotten and that Harper Rivera existed, by name and in truth. I still work at the same school, still counsel part-time. Every day, I walk into my small office, its window facing south, where the sun always pours in, at 8 a.m. On the wall across from my desk, I've hung a black and white photo. My mother, young, playing violin during a church recital. My students often ask, "Who's that?" I usually smile and say, "The first person who believed I deserved a real life." One afternoon, after finishing a class on nonviolent communication, I looked out at a room of students, actually listening, not scrolling, not distracted, and I thought, this is the legacy. Not money, not books, but every moment, someone sees the light within themselves. I lingered for a moment, letting the sunlight wash over Lucia's portrait, and I said quietly, "They buried my mother in the dark, but I will live like a light, for justice, for her, and for myself." And what about you? Have you ever felt hidden behind a curtain someone else drew for you? Ever wondered if the truth about who you are isn't what you were taught to believe? Would you be brave enough to step into the dark and light your own flame? My story isn't just about reclaiming a name. It's about reclaiming the truth, memory, and unconditional love. I'm not the only one who grew up surrounded by what was never said. But if you've ever felt forgotten, cast aside, or like a stranger in your own family, share it with me in the comments. I believe the more voices rise, the harder it is for silence to survive. Don't forget to hit follow so you won't miss the next stories about family, identity, and the journey of those who dare to live honestly. Because sometimes the only thing we need is to know we're not alone in finding our way back to who we really are.